Next on our program is Ross Hetrick, and Ross is the president of the Thaddeus Stevens Society, which promotes the legacy of Thaddeus Stevens, the great American. Ross, you're up.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's an honor to be here today to commemorate the United States colored troops, Thaddeus Stevens and Jonathan Sweeney. Thaddeus Stevens was an early and vocal advocate for the use of black troops during the Civil War. In fact, I would say that because of his actions, he could be fairly considered the father of the U.S. colored troops. As evidence of his early support, he made a speech in January 22nd, 1862, entitled "Subduing the Rebellion." By the way, I always like the fact that during the Civil War, they didn't call it the Civil War or the War of Northern Aggression, except for maybe in the South. They called it the Slaveholders' Rebellion, which I think very adequately described the whole event. In any case, in his speech, he said, well, let me back up. Early on, he said two things had to be done to win the war. One, free the slaves, and two, put them in the army. By freeing the slaves, it would eliminate for the South the labor of the slaves, thus hurting their war effort. And two, putting them in the army would supplement the North's manpower in the army. And in his speech he said, "Prejudice may be shocked, weak minds startled, weak nerves may tremble, but they must hear and adopt it. Those who now furnish the means of war, but who are the natural enemies of slaveholders, must be made our allies. Universal emancipation must be proclaimed to all. If the slaves no longer raise cotton and rice, tobacco and grain for the rebels, this war would cease in 6 months. It could not be maintained even if the liberated slaves should not lift a hand against their masters. The fields would no longer produce the means by which to sustain the war. Unconditional submission would be the immediate and necessary result." He then went on to bring up a past president, not the current president, Abraham Lincoln, but rather Andrew Jackson, which is kind of unusual considering that Andrew Jackson was a slaveholder. Yet, Thaddeus Stevens admired Jackson for his dedication to the Union, and as many of you people here may know, he fought back an attempt at secession earlier in the history. And he said, "Oh, for 6 months resurrection in the flesh of stern old Jackson. Give him power, and he would handle the rebellion with iron gloves. He would abolish slavery as the cause in the support of the insurrection. He would arm the free people of color as he did at New Orleans. He would march into the heart of slavedom, not to pick cotton and open ports for trade, but to put weapons into every freeman's hand. Treason would soon hide its diminished head. Rebellion would succumb, and he would end the war by a wholesale hanging of the leaders. A 3-month campaign and 100,000 soldiers would suffice him for this, when he would resign his power and the people would gladly return him to his honored resting place." So Thaddeus Stevens, in my opinion, hit it right on the head what he had to do. And he also brought up, and as the former speaker said, slavery was the issue in the Civil War. I always find it funny when I hear people talk about how it was not. And Thaddeus Stevens echoed this again, and he said in this same speech, "Our object should be not only to end this terrible war now, but to prevent its recurrence. All must admit that slavery is the cause of it. without slavery, we should this day be a united and happy people. Well, Lincoln had a hard time changing his mind. He kept on dithering and saying, oh, you know, the border states are going to leave us, and so on and so forth. So finally, the Congress took action about using the black soldiers. And in July 1862, Congress passed the militia law, which allowed Lincoln to use black soldiers in the military. It was shortly after that that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. However, Lincoln kept on dithering and didn't do anything about using black soldiers, and Thaddeus Stevens felt compelled to introduce another law in February of 1863. That law did pass, but when it went over to the Senate failed to pass that law because they pointed to the Militia Act and said Lincoln does have the right to use the soldiers without the use of the new law from Thaddeus Stevens. And getting people to support the use of black soldiers, Thaddeus Stevens was not above showing how it would be in the interest of white soldiers to use black soldiers. As I suppose many of you have seen the movie Glory, where at one point one of the soldiers says, black guy can stop a bullet as well as a white guy. Well, Thaddeus Stevens, in talking about that, he says, I would put these slaves where they could fight their former masters. If men are to be shot in this war, let it not be our cousins, relatives, and friends. Let it be the slaves of those traitors who have caused this war. The flower of our people are molding in the swamps of Virginia because we will not employ those who ought to be fighting this battle. Now, some people could say that's rather cynical. In my opinion, it's just trying to get as much support as possible from any quarter that he could. Yet, they did start using the black soldiers finally in the May of 1863 when the Bureau of Colored Soldiers was started by Lincoln. And that was the point when the war started turning in favor of the North. However, there was an injustice with the use of black soldiers, as many of you probably know. They were paid half the rate of white soldiers. And this was an injustice that didn't escape Thaddeus Stevens' notice. He introduced legislation which would equalize the pay between black and white soldiers. Of course, the wind comes up just as I'm speaking. And in that, he says why the black soldiers should be employed. He said, why should they not be paid alike? Why should they not all be clothed alike? Why should they not all be armed alike? Why should they not all charge the rebels alike and die alike in defense of the Union? Because they are of different descent? Indeed, if any were to have a preference over others in pay and in inducements to join the service, it ought to be that class of men whose perils are greeted when they go into our army. The black man knows when he goes there that his dangers are greater than the white man's. He runs not only the risk of being killed in battle, but the certainty, if taken prisoner, of being slaughtered instead of being treated as a prisoner of war. As a result of his legislation, which passed, the pay was equalized for black and white soldiers. As you can see from that quote, the perils for black soldiers was greater than for white soldiers. What happened, and it's an interesting point, that besides reducing manpower for the South, increasing the manpower in the North, the effect of using black soldiers had a third effect. What happened was the South, essentially, like they did on all occasions, went crazy, when they started using black soldiers. And so they passed legislation saying that if blacks were caught during battles, they were executed summarily as insurrectionists. This angered the North, and the North said, we're not going to be doing prisoner exchanges anymore. Before that point, there would be occasional exchanges between the North and the South. And this helped out the South more than it helped out the North because it replenished their manpower. But after the South went crazy and started slaughtering blacks, they said no more of that. So that deprived the South of that additional manpower and also saddled them with the extra expense of maintaining prisoner of war camps like the one in Andersonville, which they obviously didn't maintain that well. In any case, I would say that it was essential to the Civil War, and we probably could have had the Civil War shorter if Abraham Lincoln had taken the advice of Thaddeus Stevens. Of course, that is speculation, but who knows? In any case, I would like to end this with one last quote from Thaddeus Stevens about the war. And I'm getting there. One more page. What an opportunity is presented to this republic to vindicate her consistency and become immortal. The occasion is forced upon us, and the invitation presented to strike the chains of 4 millions of human beings and create them men, to extinguish slavery on this whole continent, to wipe out so far as we are concerned the most hateful and infernal blot that has ever disgraced the escutcheon of man, to write a page in history so bright it eclipses all the heroes and sages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron.